Sure.
Because it's a little bit of a hike over from the building. It's a good turnout. Yay.
Good.
How's it going?
Hey.
Tyler.
Oh, hi,
The
nice
reason I
to
wanted
meet
you
you.
to at least associate a face, I'll pick you up at the hotel this afternoon.
Yeah.
Oh,
we
okay.
got Anna's class, yeah.
Great. Sounds good.
Recognize me. My little blue-green Toyota Camry.
Toyota Camrys must be a thing in this town because Nathan has a Toyota Camry as well.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, mine's like a decade older than his.
Okay, all right, okay.
Hey, so I am curious.
I'm not proud.
So where did Anna pick for dinner tonight with the class? For you and the seminar stuff? So we had Karen in last year. We had Karen in last year.
Yeah.
Oh, right, yes. Yeah.
So they went to Cafe Excel.
I don't remember, but she said she was, I think they're bringing in food to the...
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I'll have to ask her.
So we'll have it...
Well, the class finishes like 8:30, right? I think.
6:30 to
It's
8:30.
5:30 to 8:30.
5:30 to 8. I think it's 5:30 to 8.
You will be fed.
Yes.
Do not worry.
I am
We'll
not
keep you
worried.
hydrated.
I am
We'll
not
keep you
worried.
fed.
Yes.
And
The
there'll
two
be
most important
occasional
things in life.
Light brown liquid.
Right. Yes.
That's right.
We're talking about coffee, right?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Light brown, dark brown. Are you standing up there? Okay. All right. Okay.
All right. Good morning. It's my pleasure to introduce Dennis Mummy from UNC for our Organizational Communication Research Colloquia. Many of you are aware of Dennis's work, but if you're not, I'll just highlight a few things. Dennis is the Carrie C. Boshamer Distinguished Professor of Communication. I've learned that can actually be shortened, and we can call him the Bosch Distinguished Professor in UNC speak. And he has a very distinguished research record. If you follow Dennis's work, you know he does focus on the communicative dynamics of organizational control and resistance under neoliberalism. But his work has been recognized in so many different ways. He's an ICA fellow, he's an NCA Distinguished Scholar, just to name a couple of the awards. He's published extensively, and so it's really a delight to have you here, today. As I was thinking about this, we had dinner last night, and one of the things I really appreciate about Dennis is he has this ethos of what I would call serious play. Okay.
Hang on. Can I take notes? Let me write this down.
Take this down.
Yes.
I'll give you the recording later.
All right. Okay.
Put
Okay.
that up and so on. And I guess what I mean by that is I think he exemplifies what I appreciate about excellence in scholarship. That is, there's a seriousness to his work that he's tackling important issues. I mean, one of the the golden oldies of your work, from Monographs in '87, the political function of narrative, is one of my favorite pieces because it's one of the very first pieces that says narrative does more than simply provide a tool for sense making. It does more than simply give people a sense of place. There are political and power overtones to it, and we need to take those seriously in the process of organizing. And so there's that seriousness to it, and as you'll see in the presentation, he's unpacked this notion of power and dynamics in a lot of different ways. But there's also a playfulness and a reverence. You can't be around Dennis too long before you start to laugh. In terms of his
Only in the best ways, of course. Not laugh with me rather than at me. I hope. Hopefully.
It's a with versus an at.
Right.
So I'm serious because I think that's the thing I love about Dennis as a person, but also his work. It's the seriousness that he takes his work with the playfulness in it. So I'm really looking forward to having a time to be engaged in some serious play over the next hour or so. So the title of Dennis's talk today is Communication Constitutes Capital, Branding and the Politics of Neoliberal Dis/Organization. Welcome, Dennis.
Thank you. Kevin, thanks for that playfully serious or seriously playful introduction. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. This is actually my first visit to College Station in my entire life. I arrived in the US, I think it was on August the 13th, 1980, from the UK. And this is my first visit here since then, although I do have friends and colleagues from this department who go back many years. Actually, as Kevin and Charlie and Nancy and I were at dinner last night, and we were talking about Central States Communication Conference in the spring of 1984, when I was in the last semester of my PhD program. And I was on a panel with Kevin. Kevin had 2 papers on the same panel, which completely intimidated me. I was like, who is this guy that he has 2 papers on the same panel? And of course, he was brilliant and erudite and dressed way better than me. So there were 3 reasons why I was intimidated by him. And Charlie Conrad was the respondent on the panel. Charlie was then a young assistant professor at my current institution, UNC. And actually, I mean, I owe a lot to Charlie, because that was really the first moment when I sort of realized that maybe I had something useful and interesting to say, because Charlie was incredibly complimentary about the paper that I presented. And it's sort of like, you know, your advisor is sort of meant to say nice things about your work, right? He or she is supposed to be positive, supposed to encourage you. But here was somebody I'd never met before, right, who was saying these great things about my work. And so that was sort of really the first moment when I thought, you know, maybe I've got a future in this field. So, you know, I always think of Charlie as a really sort of important person, important moment in my career. And I'm kind of sorry he's not here. I've told him this personally, but I always want to sort of publicly sort of acknowledge his role in my career. The other thing I should say is that obviously I'm very grateful to be here with 2 working arms. I was supposed to be here in January. Broke my right collarbone, sorry, that's my left collarbone, while I was at home in the UK playing soccer. 60-year-old man thinking that he can still be the 20-year-old collegiate goalkeeper that he used to be, diving full length and landing on his shoulder, breaking his collarbone. Lots of fun. Anyway, to the topic of the day. So this is an essay that will be coming out this spring in a book that's edited by Tim Kuhn and Consuelo Vasquez, called Disorganization as Communication. And it's sort of my effort to kind of think through some of the issues I'm exploring in terms of you know, branding and neoliberal capitalism. And I'd sort of like to start out by providing you with 3 quotes, which I think in many respects kind of starts to identify some of the issues that I'm talking about. So the first one is by Maurizio Lazzarato, who is an Italian autonomous Marxist theorist. Contemporary capitalism does not first arrive with factories. These follow if they follow at all. It arrives with words, signs, and images, which I think really speaks to the kind of shift that has been taking place really sort of since the 1980s in the way in which capitalism operates. The second is by Sergio Zyman, the former Chief Marketing Officer of Coca-Cola. Everything communicates. I'll talk a little bit more about this quote later, but I think it sort of speaks to some of those same issues. And the third one is from a Ford executive, late 1990s. The manufacture of cars will be a declining part of Ford's business. They will concentrate in the future on design, branding, marketing, sales, and service operations. Obviously, I think if Henry Ford saw that quote, he would probably spin in his grave. And I think actually Ford now officially only make, I think, 1 car, which is the Mustang. I think they're planning on discontinuing all of their models, or their other models, and focus on trucks. But again, this speaks to the ways in which the actual production of goods is in many ways becoming a declining feature of contemporary capitalism. So the kind of central question that I'm addressing in this essay is, you know, what does it mean to talk about communication as constitutive of organization in the context of contemporary capitalism? So that this CCO model has been sort of a stalwart kind of perspective in the field of organizational communication really since the early 1980s, this idea that communication constitutes organizing. But one of the questions for me is, as the nature of capitalism has shifted, what does that question really mean? What does it speak to? So what I'm sort of suggesting is that we need to kind of broaden the scope of the field to include not only the communicative production of organization, but also talk about the communicative organization of capitalist production, which I think, perhaps in important ways sort of shifts the kind of approach and the sort of narratives that we talk about in our work, right? So what this means for me, at least in part, is to think about how we can theorize the idea of communication constituting capital, right? Which maybe sort of gets at some of the transformations that have taken place in capitalism over the last 30 years or so. I'm not quite sure where to stand here, if I'm okay here, or if I don't want to sort of block the screen. So this is kind of what I'd like to do. First of all, sort of maybe briefly frame how we have traditionally in critical organization studies focused on issues of power and resistance. Secondly, talk about branding and communicative capitalism in the context of neoliberalism. And then third, provide a brief example. This is actually a separate essay that I have. Anybody remember Alex from Target? How many people here remember Alex from Target? A couple, okay. But actually, it sort of demonstrates my point that Alex from Target is no longer a thing. Okay? Alex from Target was sort of a phenom in the fall of 2014, I think. He sort of appeared on The Ellen Show. He was on CNBC's Fast Money show. We'll talk about him later if we have time. Okay? All right, so let me sort of, in very brief terms, kind of frame critical organization studies as it's been practiced in many respects over the last 30 years or so. Right? So obviously, sort of heavily influenced by the post-linguistic turn, this idea that communication constitutes organizing kind of came to the fore in that period with studies of questions of meaning, identity, power, ideology, and so forth. So the heavy focus was on the dialectics of managerial control and employee resistance. Okay? Pretty much heavy emphasis on organizations as material and political sites of work, sort of specific places where dialectics of control and resistance unfolded. So the focus was really on the study of control and resistance sort of at the point of production, right? And if you look at sort of labor process theory as it evolved sort of starting in the mid-70s, that was its principal focus. So for example, the iconic text in this work is Braverman's Labor and Monopoly Capital, basically the first kind of Marxist treatment of the labor process since Marx's Capital over 100 years earlier. Okay, focus on like de-skilling processes in monopoly capitalism in the 20th century. You have Burawoy's Manufacturing Consent, which was basically, after Braverman, kind of a study of, kind of a phenomenological study of the subjective experience of work sort of at the point of production through the examination of what he called the game of making out. You've got particularly derivative studies, Mumby's Communication and Power in Organizations, which is the one non-classic that I'm going to list here, which sort of focused on sort of narrative and ideology in the production of power in organizations. Collinson's Managing the Shop Floor, which is sort of a classic study of masculine subjectivity in a truck manufacturing plant, which is sort of a study of a classic kind of Fordist organization. So what all these studies have in common in many respects is that they explore the indeterminacy of labor, right? Indeterminacy of labor being the locus of control and resistance in capital organization, right? So the idea of there being a sort of a structural antagonism between capital and labor, which plays itself out at the point of production in the organization, right? So in this sense, the managerial control imperative, right, arises from the need to reduce this indeterminacy, right? So you could make the case that the entire history of management thought, right, starting in the early 20th century with Frederick Taylor, going all the way through to organizational culture work in the corporate culture work in the 1980s, is an effort to reduce this indeterminacy, to make variable capital, idea, labor, more determinate at the point of production, right? So what's really underneath all of this work is an exploration of how labor power, right, or the potential to labor, turns into actual labor and hence surplus value, right? So the focus here, using Marx's phrase, is on the hidden abode of production, right? So the production of surplus value is actually kind of hidden away in the organization, in the employment relationship in the workplace. Oops, yeah, okay. So what I'm arguing is that there's a shift that's happened in the last 30 years, right, to what I thought communicative capitalism was actually an original term that I'd come up with, but actually it's not. It's a term that was first coined by Jodi Dean in 2009. I was really disappointed to come across her book, which uses that term. But the idea that we're talking about a shift from capital-labor relationship to a capital-life relationship, right? So Stefan Bohm and Chris Land talk about the emergence of a new hidden abode of production in the context of neoliberal communicative capitalism, right? So this shift involves a movement towards cultural and social production, right, as a source and as the basis of economic value creation, right? So as Dean argues, we can say that industrial capitalism exploited labor, right? Communicative capitalism exploits communication processes and creates value through that process, right? So economic value is, the creation of economic value is no longer limited to the point of production, right? Through the emergence of what Mario Tronti, another Italian atomist theorist, refers to as the emergence of the social factory, okay? So the idea that the factory as a value creation process has become disseminated throughout society as a whole, right? So the accumulation of value, okay, is not only through the exploitation of material labor, but through the exploitation of subjectivity, affect culture, and sort of communicative flows in everyday life, right? So in this sense, to kind of moderate Sergio Simon's original notion, everything communicates, everything potentially communicates economic value, right? Everyday social interaction is potentially subject to corporate capture and hence monetization, okay? So the new struggle is not between capital and labor, but between capital and life, capital and everyday life. In this context, all life potentially becomes work, right? So my argument is that in terms of the examination of the production of value, the shift in focus is from the indeterminacy of labor to the indeterminacy of meaning and identity as the key elements of value production, right? So Dean talks about communicative capitalism as directly exploiting the social relation at the heart of value. And this shift is sort of marked by this movement to post-Fordism and neoliberalism, from a what system to a yo-yo system, okay? From a we're all in this together system to a you're on your own system, right? In which the market becomes, as Foucault talks about the market as the grid of intelligibility for everything, including even social relations become defined through this market grid of intelligibility, right? We see the emergence of, the nature of risk changes. Okay, Gina Neff talks about risk in terms of venture labor. Under traditional capitalism, we talk about venture capital. Under neoliberal capitalism, communicative capitalism, we talk about venture labor. Everybody is subject to risk, right? We see the emergence of human capital. Everybody thinks about themselves as a piece of capital in which they have to invest, right? And this is becomes particularly explicit with the rise of the of the gig economy. Okay? Brooke Duffy talks about aspirational labor, right, in her book on fashion bloggers, social media bloggers. The book is called Not Getting Paid to Do What You Love. When doing one's hobby hopefully leads into an actual career, right? So there's a kind of aspiration associated with the kind of insecure work that these bloggers engage in, right? And David Weil talks about the kind of demands of capital associated with neoliberalism creating a fissured workplace, right? Work becomes separated out, okay? He argues that, for the emergence of the private equity model, the emergence of stakeholder power, the emergence of defined contributions as opposed to defined benefits, all of these have sort of led to kind of a reworking of the workplace, to an externalization of all kinds of risks associated with the capitalist enterprise. And he argues that the basic mantra for corporations today is find your distinctive niche and stick to it, then shed everything else. Right? The last thing corporations want to do these days is to actually employ somebody full time. And they will do everything they can to avoid doing that. Right? So what we have emerging is a sort of a state of insecurity that's characterized by what Isabel Laurie calls governmental precarization. Right? Precarity becomes democratized. It becomes the new normal. Okay? Precarity is no longer associated with people who are considered marginal. It's associated with everybody. You talk to your students these days, even like well-to-do students. Okay? And they talk about feeling anxious. They talk about feeling precarious. They talk about not knowing what's going to happen next. Laurie's argument is that that is a defining feature. It's baked into neoliberal capitalism. It's not an accidental feature. Okay? It's a feature, not a bug. Okay? So we have a shift from the productive subject as defined by industrial capitalism to the entrepreneurial subject as defined by neoliberal capitalism, where everybody is turned into an entrepreneurial subject. Okay? Everybody is defined by their ability to accrue human capital. So part of what I'm arguing is that in this context, the brand can be thought about as vital. It's a German term. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it. I'm pretty sure, anybody here a native German speaker or speak fluent German? I'm pretty sure it's vital Politik. It might be vital, but I think it's vital Politik. So this is a term that comes out of the ordo-liberal economic movement around the sort of the mid-20th century. Okay? And it's sort of a movement that was sort of a pushback against sort of collectivist models of sort of collectivist economic and state models. And it's an effort to manage the market by the state. Keynesianism, to some degree, is considered to be a form of ordoliberalism. And it's the sort of the economic model that was introduced in Germany after the Second World War. And it's opposed to neoliberalism, which is the management of the state by the market. So, for example, Margaret Thatcher's comment on a BBC radio show in 1987, there is no such thing as society, kind of captures that neoliberal model. So part of what I'm arguing is that under neoliberalism, it's the brand that functions in the traditional role of the state, right? It's the mechanism through which the market as the grid of intelligibility becomes meaningful, right? Whereas under ordoliberalism, it was the state that provided the mode of social integration for society in the market, right? Under neoliberalism, the brand has taken over the role of the state. In Birth of Biopolitics, Foucault talks about how this notion of the state as vital politique sort of compensates for the coldness of the market, right? It creates the conditions under which social connection can occur. And my argument is that the brand sort of takes over that function under neoliberalism, right? So then the brand becomes this kind of flexible system of capture, right? It's constantly adjusting to shifting meanings, identities, and affects. Right? So part of what I'm arguing is that in neoliberal capitalism, meaning becomes kind of a key terrain of struggle, right? And that brands and branding play a constitutive role in this process, right? So brand mediates life itself, right? I would argue, in fact, that the goal of companies and corporations is, I mean, sort of a kind of utopian goal is to mediate every aspect of everyday life. And they try really hard to do that, right? So brand management becomes about the governance of communicative labor, managing communicative labor on an everyday basis, right? So Adam Arvidsson, who has this great book on branding, talks about the idea that life unfolds entirely within capital, that there's no longer any outside, right? Given this switch from capital labor to capital life relations. So that's just sort of my kind of current definition of a brand from a 2016 article in Organization. A constellation of signs through which processes of social interaction and communication are mediated and captured and hence transformed into economic value. So branding in this sense involves both the strategic process of image management and the putting to work of sociality and public communication in ways that reproduce or enhance the qualities that the brand image embodies. And we can potentially unpack that later in the question and answer session. So in thinking about the sort of the brand organization relationship, I would sort of argue that there are four principal important issues operating here, right? So I would argue that branding itself has fundamentally reshaped organizations, right? That corporate brands have actually transformed organizational culture, its structure, and its strategy, right? So brands are becoming, under neoliberal capitalism, brands are becoming the actual organizing mechanism, the organizing principle of business, actually working from the outside in, right? So the brand is an extension of the company. Sorry, the brand is not an extension of the company is an extension of the brand, right? So this idea of figuring out your niche and sticking to it is sort of framed around what does the brand mean to the company, right? How do we sort of externalize everything else that's not associated with the brand? And that quote from the Ford executive kind of exemplifies this kind of orientation. So if you think about Apple, right? Apple, worldwide, there are about 750,000 people involved in the production of Apple products. Only about 60,000 of those people actually work for Apple, right? So Apple is a design company. Apple is a brand management company. It is not a manufacturing company in terms of what it actually does. Secondly, I would suggest that leveraging brand equity is one of the principal means to which organizations translate potential into economic value, right? Obviously, companies like Nike and Virgin have done this very well. Nike was one of the first companies to figure out that it wasn't about making things, it was about branding lifestyles, right? So Phil Knight founded Nike as an athletic shoe company, selling athletic shoes to serious athletes, right? He worked with Bill Bowerman, who was his track coach at the University of Oregon, and Bill Bowerman designed these waffle soles, right? And the idea was to actually sell athletic shoes. They very quickly figured out that they weren't selling athletic shoes to athletes, they were selling a brand, they were selling a lifestyle to people. And once they realized that, that's when the company took off. I mean, Virgin similarly, right? Virgin started out as a little record store where when I was in college, I would go buy the latest Sex Pistols single, right? And then it became this global brand, which includes everything from, do they still sell records? Probably not, right? I mean, they have there's an airline, they run a train company in Britain, they do insurance, they do financial services, they do phones in Britain, they have everything. So it's all about the particular brand. It's not about the product at all. And I would also argue, and I think this is particularly significant at the current sort of historical moment, that politically brands increasingly insert themselves into the organization of stakeholder struggles and around competing interests. Like brands create publics and organize sort of political issues around and through those publics, right? So one could make the case that corporations increasingly position themselves to take on the role occupied in modernity by practices of citizenship. So brands become citizens, right? Brands become agents that organize particular sort of political issues, right? So you will hear a lot of brand strategists making the case that branding serves a democratizing function, right? Raising awareness and engagement around particular social issues. It's difficult to find a brand these days that doesn't engage a particular social issue. You maybe remember the catastrophic Starbucks Race Together initiative in the sort of the aftermath of Ferguson and Black Lives Matter. Nike and their Colin Kaepernick relationship. Dove has an ongoing sort of body image issue, women's body image, women's beauty issues. But that's a sort of extremely common aspect of brand strategy. And consistent with this, brands function as a principal interpretive frame through which sense-making and identity construction occurs. Right? So Arvidsson talks about brand management is about the making the becoming of subjects and the becoming of value coincide. So subjectivity and the capital accumulation processes kind of go together hand in hand, right? And I make the case that brands are kind of a point of purchase in the double sense, right? People purchase brands, and they're also sort of a point of purchase for self-identity in conditions of radical uncertainty. And they attempt to create a kind of moral order. So like the idea of heroic disruption, particularly associated with entrepreneurial capitalism, is a very common trope, very common sort of branding trope amongst both regular workers and companies as well. Right? So basically, my argument is that what companies aim to do is mediate everyday experience through brands. So the idea that brands provide what one brand strategist calls mecosystems. Did you all know that each of you has a mecosystem? Would you like to know what a mecosystem is? You probably don't want to know, right? Right? I'll show that in a second. But Angela McRobbie has a fabulous book. Angela McRobbie is a cultural studies scholar. She has a book which came out in 2016 called Be Creative, where she looks at professional workers in creative industries and argues that one of the things, it's a very sort of insecure industry, and she makes the case that what these workers tend to do is build, because there are no sort of, most of the kind of structural securities associated with, Fordist forms of work have kind of disappeared, and so they need to create these sort of individual microstructures. And so the idea of creativity becomes sort of a central, he uses the Foucault's term dispositif to talk about how creativity becomes kind of the central apparatus around which their microstructures are built. So this is a mecosystem, which brands and brand strategists are all eager for you to have, for each one of you to have. So Jez Frampton is global CEO of Interbrand, which is a brand strategy company. Every year, Interbrand publishes a list of the most valuable brands. Currently, Apple is the most valuable brand. They value it at somewhere around $215 billion. I think Apple, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and I think Coca-Cola is still in the top 5 brands. Those are the most. So this is not the market value of the company. This is the brand value of the company, right? So an ecosystem is a select set of brands that create customized experiences around a single individual, where every brand in consideration slots in seamlessly, and where the most valuable micro moments are curated, connected, and choreographed. As people shape their ecosystems, as they explore and, just as importantly, edit, they are constantly being redefined, meaning that brands need to earn the right to stay in this set every minute of every day. Right? So that gives you a real sense of how brand strategists themselves are thinking about the micro management of everyday experience. That brand management is sort of a moment-to-moment experience, and that everybody should think about brands in that kind of context. I've sort of particularly, do you know, everyone know who Fiverr is? Fiverr's a sort of an online platform that enables people to sort of be what they call lean entrepreneurs. They sort of like, it's a bit like TaskRabbit. They can sort of provide services to people for not very much. So I think Fiverr has had a fascinating series of ads which kind of captures this sort of idea of people as human capital, right? You eat a coffee for lunch, you follow through on your follow-through, sleep deprivation is your drug of choice, you might be a doer. In doers we trust, okay? This second one I think is a particularly interesting ad. Nothing like a safe, reliable paycheck to crush your soul. Okay, think about that in terms of how workers are constructed as human capital who really are in a yo-yo context. They really are on their own. I'm sort of fascinated by the graffiti here. Join a union, fight together for higher pay. That's why Fiverr only wants to pay freelancers $5 per task. Low wages for all, says Fiverr. Fuck that, right? So this is sort of endemic of the ways in which brands are attempting to sort of insert themselves into a system of governmental precarization, right? Where precarity has become normalized. Everybody is subject to risk, and everybody has to assume risk as sort of an everyday sort of feature of life. And that in fact, like having a secure paycheck is sort of anathema to a spirit of enterprise. Which sort of brings me to, you familiar with WeWork? Right, so the rise of the WeWorking class is actually a title that I shamelessly stole from a recent New York Times article. So WeWork, I think, is a really sort of interesting manifestation of sort of insecure work and the gig economy. WeWork describes itself as this mission to create a world where people work to make a life, not just a living. And the founders said, when we started WeWork in 2010, we wanted to build more than beautiful shared office spaces. We wanted to build a community, a place you join as an individual, me, but where you become part of a greater we, a place where we're redefining success measured by personal fulfillment, not just the bottom line. Community is our catalyst. So, I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting about this is that in a sort of a insecure economy, in a sort of precarious economy, WeWork is has recreated sort of corporate culture, but it's outsourced corporate culture is basically what it is. It's office culture as a service, right? So let's quote from this New York Times article. The company was receptive enough to realize that disaggregated workers, or at least of a certain class, did not want to hear that they should just kill it on their own, like Fiverr, right? What WeWork offered was not just rhetoric, a more sympathetic description of the restless, fretful life of the deinstitutionalized worker, but true shelter from a pervasive sense of alienation. Where Fiverr issued an invitation to gladiatorial combat, WeWork promised a work environment remodeled for solace and dignity. So here we have sort of a brand that attempts to sort of reintroduce community and culture into a sort of a gig economy environment, right? So the case can be made that WeWork kind of occupies the gap between belonging and autonomy that the sort of the gig economy has kind of created, right? So it's kind of WeWork is kind of an incredibly successful. I think they're thinking about going public soon. I think that they've been valued at about $50 billion, but an incredibly successful branded response to the Fisher workplace. Alex from Target. So just for those of you who aren't familiar with Alex from Target, so Alex from Target at the time, the time this photograph was taken, was a 16-year-old boy living in the suburbs of Dallas. One Sunday morning in November, his dad drives him to his Sunday shift at Target. So starts his shift at 10 o'clock. So in the first couple of hours of his shift, he starts to notice that lots of young girls start to show up, sort of giggling. He's actually is on checkout, taking photographs of him, right? At one point, it gets so bad that his supervisor, who was a high school senior, has to take him off checkout and send him into a storage room to do work back there. When he turns on his phone at the end of his shift, it turns out that his Twitter following has gone from about 120 on his Twitter account to over 100,000. So it turns out that some young woman came and took his photograph, posted this photograph on Twitter, and it basically went viral. So I think within the first week of this happening, Alex appeared on the Ellen DeGeneres show. He was then on the CNBC Fast Money show. But it's sort of a fascinating example of the ways in which the process of corporate capture occurs. I actually there's an essay that I did on Alex from Target in Boris Roman's book, The Agency of Organizing. So one of the questions that I was asking about this is, how is Alex constructed as a brand with economic value? In other words, some ordinary 16-year-old kid all of a sudden being a part of the attention economy, right, and potentially having economic value, right? So how does Alex kind of exemplify the process of corporate capture, where everyday social interaction is put to work for capital, right? And in what sense is Alex a floating signifier? So every brand is subject to the sort of floating signifier. In other words, the kind of meanings that are associated with particular brands are completely arbitrary. So the question becomes, what kind of signifiers get attached to particular brands, and what kind of communicative labor is required to turn somebody like Alex from Target into a brand? So with that, I just want to show you a short clip from his I'm really hoping this is going to load. Sometimes it takes a... Uh-oh. We have a tech problem. All right.
Yeah.
Anna, come save me.
I'll try. No guarantees here. But I know, pressure.
I knew I should have tested it before I started.
I may be able to, if I'm not ruining anything by going into your slides here.
Mm-mm.
Okay.
Is it?
It's that the internet's not connected. I'll connect you here.
Oh, that would do it.
I like that I'm proving myself as techie right now. I learned about Alex from Target by reading your article, one of your writings about him.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, I did.
You'll need to go back to slideshow to, the link won't work otherwise.
Okay. We'll see if it connects here before I walk away, though. Because we can always open the hyperlink, too. Okay, hold on.
We may have to abandon Alex from Target. Leave him to his own devices.
Well, we've got one more approach here. Oh, maybe not. Something's wrong.
Yeah, it's his interview on CNBC, the Fast Money Show. That's
Okay.
But what time do we finish, Kevin?
45.
Okay, so yeah, we might want to forego it anyway. If
You want to?
Well, go
I can
ahead.
find it in a second.
It's about a 6-minute on CNBC. Yep, there you go. Yep. No, that's not it. Don't see it.
Let me put quotes around Alex from Target real fast and see if it.
All right.
Did it come up? Is it this one right here?
Doesn't look like it, no.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's abandon Alex from Target. We probably, but it's basically I would encourage you to try and find it on the internet. But it's basically Alex gets an agent called John Shahidi, and Shahidi spends all this time sort of kind of constructing Alex as a brand during the interview, talking about how Alex is doing great and he's going to do sort of fantastic things and he and his family is great, and it's a perfect example of how this Alex as sort of a floating signifier becomes imbued with a particular kind of meaning. And it's also hilarious as well, because poor Alex is sort of sitting there and he has no idea what's going on, and he's just this kid, right, who has no particular skill set or anything. He's just sort of, he's attracted all these eyeballs, so he's become part of the attention economy, and thereby has the potential to accumulate economic value, right? Alex, after this, he became part of a group called Digitours, which is an organization which takes social media influencers and they go around to various events and sign autographs and do stuff like that. But he's sort of, he's disappeared now, right? Because he, obviously he had no particular skill set to offer. He was just, he sort of flamed and then he was extinguished. Not literally, obviously, but. So just to finish off, so part of what I'm arguing here is that the brand is a response to existential insecurity in neoliberalism, right? That the brand has come to replace previous sources of stability, right? That it speaks to the homelessness of the neoliberal subject, right? Jennifer Wingard talks about how branding redirects the anxieties that the material conditions of neoliberal capitalism produce through employment, economic disenfranchisement, and changing demographics. In that sense, the brand functions as this as vital politique, right? It creates a sense of connection. It creates a sense of security and social order, right? But at the same time, brands are both incredibly powerful and incredibly vulnerable. They always contain an excess of meaning. They always contain an indeterminacy, right? And therefore are always a site of struggle, right? So in that sense, struggle takes place at the level of meaning rather than necessarily simply taking place at the level of action, or obviously it's connected to collective action too, right? So in this sense, we can think about brands as constitutive of organizing beyond organization. And it's a notion that I think is central to understanding the dynamics of contemporary communicative capitalism, right? So in this sense, brands profoundly shape the democratic process. In fact, I think we could potentially argue that we now have the president that we have precisely because of his ability to articulate a particularly strong brand. That he is a president associated with affect, right? People have strong feelings about our current president, right? On one side or the other, right? I mean, there's a sense in which there is no sort of middle ground with Donald Trump, right? There's a sense in which you don't sort of think of him in terms of like, maybe he's a good president, maybe he's a bad president. You might think of him as a really great president or a really bad president. And I think in many respects, part of what he's been able to do is create a brand through a process of creating a system of chaos and then providing solutions to the kind of the chaos that he's created. But I think in many respects the next election will play out through negotiations over particular narratives and kind of articulations of a particular moral order. And I think the ability of whoever can kind of articulate the strongest brand is perhaps the person who will win the election. And with that, and with apologies to Alex from Target, I will thank you and invite your questions. Sandra.
Can you say something about Trump's brand for himself versus Trump as brand, as nation brand? Individual brand versus nation brand?
I mean, do you see the two things as particularly separate? I mean, I think Trump had,
So the argument, the nation brand argument would be that it's an innovation in nation branding to identify the nation with the individual, which has all kinds of other dynamics that affect democracy, as you were alluding to. And that is different. If the U.S. is Trump, that is a different thing from Trump being Trump.
So, I mean, when you think about nation branding as associated with the individual, I mean, are you sort of thinking about somebody like Vladimir Putin or?
About Trump. Trump seems to me unique in this regard. I'm new to studying nation branding, so I'm sophisticated about this. But it seems to me he has taken a new move in nation branding.
So, I mean, the association of a nation with a particular individual.
Right.
Yeah, well, and I think, in
In a democratic context, in a totalitarian context, we get it all the time.
Yeah, but there is, I saw a clip the other day of some woman speaking at an event who said, I never thought I'd say this, but if we were to have a dictator in this country, I would want it to be Donald Trump. Right? So, I think there is a sense in which, it's sort of funny, but it's sort of not funny too, right? I think there is a sense in which, isn't there a sort of there's almost an isomorphism between Trump as brand and his effort to sort of rebrand the nation, right?
But those are two different processes. I think what's interesting there, and as I say, I'm new to this literature, so this may be an unsophisticated take, but that as the two are coming together, that's something I'm interested in from the nation branding, because it has lots of impacts actually on communication law and policy, because of the directions in which he's going with that. So that's where I come in on it. But, so I was just wondering if you would have different things to say about Trump as brand if you were starting from the nation branding side as opposed to the individual side.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, I mean, I don't know enough about the nation brand. I mean, the nation branding part is not something. I actually have a book sitting on my desk right now called I think it's called Branding the Nation, which I haven't actually opened yet. But it's but I mean, yeah, I mean, it's interesting how nation branding has sort of become a thing in recent years, right? I mean, as an explicit thing. I'm just sort of having a hard time thinking about how. I mean, I could sort of make some observations about Trump brand and nation brand connect, but I'm trying to sort of sort through. So you're making the argument that. Repeat the question, maybe.
That the innovation, in my view, he's innovated in a lot of different areas having to do with information policy, communication law and policy. One of those has to do with nation branding, and one piece of that, of about half a dozen pieces, is the identification of the country with the individual.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's sort of he is trying to remake the U.S. on the world stage, right? Through his personal brand.
So my question, but it's not just his personal brand anymore. So that was my question.
Okay.
Is there a difference in understanding the branding, using your wonderful, brilliant, actually analysis? Thank you very much for this talk. Would there be anything different in the analysis if you start from the nation branding side as opposed to the individual branding side?
Yeah,
I think they're different dynamics.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and actually, I don't know how to answer that question right now. I don't know how to, but it's a really interesting one to think through, actually.
Just add that the nation branding has been there. I wouldn't think of that as an innovation of Trump. I know
Right.
I know that we talk now a lot is Modi's India.
Yes.
And so
Right.
Modi's pre-Trump. And that was also not the first. I would argue even countries like Singapore have done
Yeah, or even
such
like
strong nation branding from day one, and it's so much also. It is, I mean, the head of Singapore. I mean, although it's a democracy, it's kind of a dictatorship, but.
So the two distinctions.
Actually, those two have already gone together in other contexts, and I think nation branding has a longer history.
Oh, nation branding has been
in terms of connecting with the head. I don't think it's a Trump innovation for sure.
So that would be a debatable point. I think the distinction I was making was between totalitarian and genuinely democratic. I mean, there's a lot in the nation branding literature on the professionalization, the corporatization, privatization that's now a small group of consultants who are largely British and U.S. based, who are designing the brands rather than anything that came up through either governmental processes or popular processes.
Right.
So
right, or like some. I mean, I think.
ostensibly democratic.
Yeah. So I think a good example of it. I think like Britain in the 1990s, right, with the emergence of like Cool Britannia, right, and
Nation branding is decades. I wasn't saying that.
yeah, but in terms of like I mean, that's a very different in terms of like a democratic society sort of rebranding itself, right? So I mean, the Labour Party knew that if it was going to get back into power, it had to remake itself, rebrand itself. You know, Tony Blair did that,
Whole different process.
and that became sort of this kind of Cool Britannia sort of model, right? But yeah, that question of like, you know, which the Trump democracy relationship in terms of like, when you start with the nation and then, you know, think about the Trump brand, or start with Trump and then go think about how he's sort of remaking the nation is sort of is a really interesting question, which I'd have to kind of think through. But thanks, and maybe we can talk about it a bit more later. Too.
What is your take on like a corporation like Nike connecting itself with Serena Williams and Colin Kaepernick, and their sort of like their resistance, their protest to what's going on in African American communities? Do you feel like Nike is taking a gamble or risk doing this? How do you see themselves branding themselves?
Yeah, I don't think they're taking a risk at all. I mean, I think they fully understand what they're doing, right? I think it's a very smart sort of process of corporate capture. I mean, there was a bit of a backlash. There were certain groups who were like had a sort of a boycott Nike process, right? But I think, you know, these brands are extremely smart in terms of their ability to identify particular social movements and particular political moments, and to capitalize on those.
Do you think these strategies would have been implemented like 2 decades ago, 20, 30 years ago?
I mean, they've been around for a little while. I mean, there's a whole history. I mean, I didn't sort of talk about this because I thought maybe some of you probably knew it or it was a little bit boring, but there's a whole history in terms of how, brand strategies have evolved sort of in the post-war period, right? So, I mean, certainly for the first half of the 20th century and into probably, certainly after the Second World War too, there was sort of a, mass production, mass consumption model, and so brands were sort of marketed with a particular kind of, monolithic consumer in mind, right? And then you start to see in the sort of the 60s and 70s with the emergence of the civil rights movement, the feminist movement and so forth, the emergence of sort of niche marketing, right? The idea of sort of, the connection between brands and authenticity, right? Creating this sort of, Dove had this great series of ads from the 1980s identifying different groups of women and showing different ads in terms of, that spoke to different women demographically and racially speaking, right? And then you start to see in the 90s, particularly with the emergence of social media, right? So brands as engagement, this idea that you can engage with specific groups of people and even individuals around particular social issues, right? So the brand sort of takes on this kind of autonomy. It takes on this kind of institutional force, right? It becomes, that's why, in a sense, brands start to engage directly in dialogue with people, right? Brands are no longer static, right? And consumers are seen in sort of more and more differentiated ways, right? So certainly that kind of effort that Nike made with Colin Kaepernick, that process has been around now for probably 20 years or so, sort of starting in the late 1990s. But the idea that brands are sort of engaged in this process of sort of prosumption in many ways. Right? Brands depend upon the active engagement of consumers with the brand, right? So the constant feedback to the brand. Douglas Holt has this article called "When Brands Cause Trouble," right? And brands depend on friction. Brands depend on friction from various stakeholders to enable them to sort of stay dynamic, right? To constantly sort of adapt to political and social change, right? And so I think Nike is very responsive, and always have been very responsive in that way. Lots of these brand strategists, they employ brand ethnographers to go out into, and Nike has done it for decades. They go out into local communities and they figure out, like, who are the trendsetters? Who are the kids who are doing interesting things that haven't sort of been mainstreamed yet, but it look like they're gonna mainstream, right? And so they recruit those. There are brand ambassadors who do unpaid labor, right, to promote brands, to sort of develop new formulations of the brand, who try out beta test products and all that kind of stuff. So in that sense, there's for quite a while now, there's been this kind of dynamic relationship between brands and consumers, and that sort of the producer-consumer relationship has really kind of broken down in a lot of ways. Yeah.
In the gig economy, individuals are also brands.
Yes.
And then there is but when you say brands, you're talking about the larger brands.
I'm talking about both, actually.
And then, actually, for the individual, sometimes the larger umbrella, like you say, is providing some kind of comfort in this context of precarity.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also competition, right? So the vulnerability of the brand. How can you talk about it as a security when it's actually so kind of ephemeral?
It's an always deferred security,
and
right? Security, yeah.
And seems like whenever a particular individual brand or an individual's brand then the larger brand consumes that? Or do they then, or do they just, do they own them now, or do they not?
Yeah, most people, I mean, it's just, I mean, like I mean, a number of our students, right, they sort of, I mean, some of them want to become media influencers, like YouTube influencers or whatever, right? But for the most part, they are just taught to think that they have their own individual brand, right? And that brand is just about, you know, being successful in the traditional sense, right? I mean, we used to have, I mean, part of the issue now, of course, is that, you know, in some respects, people like Kevin and I are sort of relics of an old system, right? We have this sort of, I mean, I say to my students that there are only two good jobs left in America. One is Supreme Court Justice, the other is tenured college professor. I mean, that's it, right? Everybody else is engaged in this process of what Richard Florida calls horizontal hypermobility, right? That everybody is sort of, our students are all anxious, they're moving from job to job, they're trying to figure out how to, you know, create, you know, a persona, an identity that's going to enable them to be successful, right? And so there's this sort of constant restless sense of always needing to do more, right? They've got to sort of have, you know, all kinds of different things on their resumes, right? Which sort of, I mean, I actually found out in one of my classes the other day that the School of Journalism has a branding class. A self-branding class. So they teach students, I don't know if you have one here, right? They teach students to self-brand, right? And so, you know, there's this sort of constant process, and this is sort of a lifelong process, right? It's not like, you know, you have a degree. As I was saying to me, if you were born in the 1950s or 60s, and particularly if you were white male, right, you sort of got your college degree, and then you sort of started on that sort of bounded career path, that upward trajectory, right? That virtually doesn't exist anymore, right? So even people, I mean, think about this recent academic scandal about you know, the blackmail scandal. So you've got these incredibly sort of hyper-rich, sort of 1% people who are feeling insecure and anxious for their kids, right? Who will spend up to $5 million to get their kid into USC or Harvard or wherever. I mean, if that's not a sort of a manifestation of anxiety and precarity, even amongst the 1%, because they're not, you know, they've got to make sure that they can compete with everybody else in their particular little tiny demographic group, right? I mean, photoshopping your kid's picture onto a picture of somebody rowing, I mean, right? I mean, it's astonishing, right? But it speaks to the ways in which, you know, insecurity and precarity is become normalized. It's become built. It's no longer something associated with people who are considered marginal in society, right? It's a part of the way in which sort of, you know, the neoliberal model kind of, you know, creates that sort of entrepreneurial subjectivity, right? Yeah, at the back.
Talking about this doesn't feel real, this doesn't feel authentic, and they put a high value on what feels like authenticity. And I don't know if that's resistance to this, the neoliberal system putting them in this position, or if it's something else. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I think there is a lot. This is why I say that, you know, in many respects, you know, brands are both incredibly powerful and incredibly vulnerable, right? They are. I mean, it doesn't take much for, you know, a brand to be, you know, to be squished or exposed. I mean, I think Lori Loughlin's brand is probably not worth very much right now, right? And I don't think her daughter's brand, you know, because her daughter is a YouTube influencer, right? I mean, she posted, right? So I think, you know, her brand has probably gone kaput. But I think I think you're right. I mean, I think there really is. I think a lot of students. I hear a lot of my students doing the same thing, like pushing back against that idea that they have to be constantly branding themselves, that and I think they're thinking about you know, careers in quite sort of different ways. I mean, there's a lot of sort of literature out there right now on like these sort of post-work models of refusal, like worker refuse, like Kathy Weeks and Peter Fleming and folks like that, who are sort of, thinking about sort of ways to escape the sort of the neoliberal capitalist treadmill. And I think there are aspects of the sharing economy which perhaps lend itself to sort of moving past that, even though the sharing economy now is sort of being kind of appropriated by platform capitalism, right? That's part of the problem there. But I think you are seeing a lot of resistance to this sort of this kind of entrepreneurial model of the self, which is prevalent at the moment. Yeah.
It's interesting you say that. You all know that we now have a new school of innovation here at A&M, and they are putting forth the entrepreneurship minor, and it's.
Yep, we have one at UNC too.
Yeah, defined before you were defined, kind of goes behind or underlies, I think, the personal branding. But yes, we teach our students to represent yourselves online, make sure that you put forth what you want people to know about you before somebody constructs something about you.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know how that fits into it either. I know what Sarah's talking about. We think about that all the branding kind of creates an idealized reality, and yet then spending all your time watching other people on YouTube or watching people, kids watch kids play with toys on YouTube. We all the random, all of that. And so now is that really seeking what's real, or does that become the brand? It's like we eat it up and then turn it into something not real.
Yeah, well, and it's, yeah, I mean, it's sort of, sorry, I'm kind of lost my train of thought. Something I was going to say. Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, we
get addicted to precariousness.
I think you're absolutely right. I think the idea of sort of, anxiety is sort of a, if we're not anxious, there's something wrong,
Well, you're doing
right?
mean thing out of there. I become a doer. The woman who said, if I eat coffee for lunch.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that is, in some respects, is sort of the iconic image of the gig economy. Right? But it's also, there's a really interesting article. I think the author's name is Nathan Heller, that came out in the New Yorker. About, the gig economy is a lonely economy.
Yes.
Right. I mean, one of the things about the gig, and Angela McRobbie talks about this in Be Creative, how, in some respects, it's so difficult to organize precisely because we're all sort of individual workers. I mean, one of the things about the old labor movement, right, was that people worked collectively and worked alongside each other, and so so collective action was, in some ways, sort of easier. That sense of solidarity was easier. I mean, today everybody's sort of functioning individually, right, and might not even sort of come in contact with another worker for several days, right? And so that makes sort of collective resistance potentially more difficult. Obviously, today we have social media to sort of help with that, but yeah.
So thank you so much. Dennis will be here today and maybe early tomorrow, so please don't leave him alone.
I hate to be alone.
So thank you so much, Dennis.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for coming.
The Sex Pistols and Jody Dean in it.
Yeah, you're doing
All right. I like your shoes, by the way. I almost came out to you before they said oh, that's pretty close.
I've got the PF Flyers, but I also have Converse.
All right, okay. Thanks for coming. Hey.
Hi, I'm Caitlin Bennett. I'm in
Caitlin.
Dr. Conrad's
Oh,
class,
great.
actually. Yeah. I was just wondering if I could have a chance to maybe pick your brain about the comm department at UNC. It's
Yeah,
one
of
the
course.
places I'm looking at doing my graduate.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
So let me just. I'm just looking at my schedule to figure out. So when we. So are you involved in any of this stuff, or are you in this seminar? No, okay.
I'm not. No, I'm an undergraduate.
Oh, I see. Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah. Well, I've got. I mean, do you want to take 5 minutes now?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm in no rush.
Yeah. Grab a seat.
I'm in Dr. Conrad's class right now, so if I tell him why I'm late, he'll be fine.
All right. Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
And telling you were talking with me too. So
Yes,
you know, so, yeah.
He told me to come here actually. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Well, I'm interested in UNC because they have the direct admit to go straight through to your PhD, which is
Right. Yes. Yeah. So and you're thinking. So what are you now? Like, are you a senior right now? A junior? Or?
Senior. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So you're thinking about applying for.
I graduated in December, so then applying
Right.
to start fall of 2020.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So we. So the program it sort of it fits quite. If you think about the kind of work that Professor Conrad does, it sort of fits quite well with that in terms of sort of the entire department is sort of focused on issues of, power, culture, ideology, everyday life. So it's kind of a critical cultural sort of program. So regardless of the areas that faculty are in, they sort of do sort of work along those lines. So we focus on interpersonal and organizational, media studies and technology, performance studies, and rhetoric are the major sort of areas of the program. We always, 5 years of funding guaranteed, right? And then you have a sort of a teaching stipend, you work as a teaching assistant. And I presume are you sort of interested in the OrgComm stuff, or?
Much more of a rhetorician.
Oh, okay, all right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think we have I think strongly sort of critically oriented rhetoric program. Carol Blair, Eric Watts, Chris Lundberg, really smart, interesting people. Corey Dauber, who does research on terrorism. Rhetoric has always been sort of a pretty strong focus of the program. So UNC's, have you ever been to Chapel Hill?
I have not, no. I have some friends who went there and it looks beautiful, but I've never been over.
Yeah, no, it's a very strongly the university is kind of oriented around the liberal arts. It's about half the size of A&M, probably about 30,000 students total. There's a very strong sort of grad student culture, so the grad students are very much kind of involved in the department. Plenty of opportunities to collaborate both with other grad students and with faculty members. We do so there's like a core set of courses that you take, core sort of theory classes, which kind of sort of provides everybody with kind of a theoretical foundation for the program. And I guess the other thing is that you're given an opportunity to kind of build your own program. So the focus is always on rather than being in a particular area, the focus is on what are the research questions that drive you, right? And how do you build a program around those research questions? So I would encourage you, so when you're thinking about writing a statement of interest kind of thing, framing it around what are your particular research interests? What are the problems that you're interested in focusing on? And how can the UNC program help you do that? And maybe mention particular faculty that you might see as. And it doesn't matter if you say you could include faculty from several different areas, right? To indicate that you understand that it's a very kind of interdisciplinary program. Yeah. Exactly. So rather than say, I want to study rhetoric. Say, these are the questions I'm interested in addressing. Right. So I think that's probably the best advice I can give you in terms of how you would apply to the program. So I don't think there are other things that I should tell you about it. So yeah, so the stipend's not. I mean, in terms of dollar amount, it's not particularly high compared with some of the programs. But in terms of the responsibilities, we typically require only like the equivalent of like a 1-1 teaching load. Most programs require like a 2-2 teaching load. So you know, our sort of goal is to kind of, you know, enable you to get through the program in 5. You know, coming with a bachelor's degree, getting through in 5 or 6 years. You know, so. And I would encourage you, you know, if we get offers out by, so you would apply for the sort of the fall of 2020, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you get an offer, then we offer a, it's like sort of a welcome weekend that we do in March. And that's always a good opportunity to talk directly to grad students and faculty and sort of see the town and the campus and the department and that kind of stuff. Oh. So remind me of your name again?
I'm Caitlin.
Caitlin, right?
Nice to
Yes,
meet you.
yes. Yeah. Well, great. No, I'm glad to hear that you're that you're interested in grad school,
Yes.
and B, that you're interested in UNC.
Yeah, it looks wonderful. The program looks really interesting from what I've seen online.
Yeah, and I think you'd love living in that area.
Yeah, it looks
Good.
beautiful. I had a lot of friends who went to do their undergraduate there, so they loved it.
Yeah. No, Carolina undergrads
I'll try to
are.
get you back when you're over in the office.
All right, great. You know, they're incredibly loyal to the institution.
Yes,
you
I've
know.
noticed that.
Yes,
Yeah.
they are. They stay lifelong Tar Heels.
Yes.
You know.
Yes, indeed.
So, yeah. Oh, great.
Yeah.
It's nice to meet you.
Yeah. And where in England are you from?
So I come from a small town about 3 hours north of London. So on the east coast. The area is called Lincolnshire.
Yeah.
But it's like have you been over there?
I lived in Lakenheath for a couple years.
In where?
Lakenheath.
Where's that?
Cambridgeshire.
Oh,
It's where
okay, yeah.
their base is.
So I'm north of Cambridgeshire,
Yeah,
right? So
yeah.
just like an hour further, an hour and a half further up the coast,
Yeah.
basically. Yeah. Oh, great. So did you enjoy it when you were there?
I loved it. Yeah, it was wonderful.
Yeah, it's not a bad place to be.
It's not. It's beautiful. It's beautiful.
Yeah. You too, Kristen. Caitlin, sorry.